She had 2 silver medallions in her coat pocket, and a secret she'd been carrying for 3 months. Naomi Cross stood in the hallway of the mansion she had helped build, not with her hands, but with 7 years of strategy, sacrifice, and silence, and she heard her sister's laugh coming from behind her husband's office door. That laugh. She had heard it 10,000 times growing up, at kitchen tables, at funerals. On the worst nights of their lives, Camille always found something to laugh at. Naomi's hand touched her stomach. She wasn't showing yet. Nobody knew. She pushed open the door. Roman DeLuca and Camille Cross separated like two people caught in something they couldn't name. And on the desk between them sat documents, printed, signed, organized, with Camille's name listed as Roman's primary representative to 3 of the organization's most powerful allied families. Not Naomi's name. Camille's. Naomi looked at her husband, then at her sister. Then she put the 2 silver medallions back into her pocket, turned around, and walked out. She never told them about the twins. If you've ever trusted someone completely, and I mean completely, the kind of trust where you stop checking, stop wondering, stop protecting yourself because you genuinely believe you don't need to, then you already know exactly what Naomi felt in that hallway. You don't need me to describe it. It lives in a specific place in the chest, and it doesn't feel like fire. It feels like cold water filling a room you can't get out of. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside you, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. This channel tells stories about women who were underestimated, betrayed, and forced to rebuild, and we do it every single week. Hit the like button too, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. It genuinely means everything to see your names coming in from places I've never even visited. Now let's go back to Naomi. 7 years is a long time to build something with someone. 7 years of early mornings when Roman's phone rang at 4 a.m., and Naomi would lie there in the dark, listening to the controlled, low register of his voice as he handled whatever had gone wrong overnight, because something always went wrong. 7 years of dinners that got cold because a meeting ran long. 7 years of learning to read a room full of dangerous men and knowing exactly when to speak and exactly when to stay quiet, because in Roman DeLuca's world, the wrong word at the wrong moment could end a person. Naomi had never been afraid of that world. That was the part most people misunderstood about her. She hadn't fallen into Roman's life by accident or by being naive. She had walked into it with her eyes completely open, carrying her own ambitions and her own intelligence, and she had made herself indispensable, not as a decoration on Roman's arm, not as the woman who smiled at the right moments and disappeared after dinner, but as the person who actually held the financial architecture of the DeLuca organization together. The port contracts, the legitimate shipping agreements, the banking relationships that allowed Roman's very questionable money to eventually become very clean money that could sit in an account without making federal investigators curious. None of that happened because Roman DeLuca was charming. It happened because Naomi Cross was brilliant, and she worked at it every single day. Roman knew that. In the beginning, he was never shy about saying so. He used to tell people, in rooms full of men who would have preferred to pretend Naomi wasn't there, that she was the sharpest mind he'd ever sat across a table from. That without her, the legitimate side of the DeLuca operation would still be a collection of half-managed front companies bleeding money in 4 different directions. He said it so often, for so many years, that Naomi made the mistake a lot of brilliant women make. She started believing he actually valued what she did instead of just the results it produced for him. The pregnancy was not planned, which was part of why it felt like something close to a miracle. Naomi and Roman had been trying for years, quietly, privately, with the particular kind of grief that couples carry when the thing they want most keeps not happening. There had been appointments, procedures, hope followed by loss, and then eventually a kind of exhausted silence around the subject that neither of them knew how to break. She found out on a Tuesday morning in a hotel bathroom in Geneva, where she had been finalizing a shipping contract that would move more legitimate cargo through DeLuca-controlled ports than anything the family had managed in 2 decades. 2 lines. She sat on the edge of the hotel bathtub for 20 minutes, not moving, just breathing. Then she picked up her phone to call Roman, and stopped. She wanted to tell him in person. She wanted to see his face. After everything they had been through trying to get here, she wanted that moment to be real and physical, and something she could hold on to. And then, 3 days later, a follow-up ultrasound showed her something the first one hadn't. Not one heartbeat. 2. Twins. She bought 2 silver medallions at a jeweler in Geneva. Old DeLuca tradition. When a new heir was coming, the family used silver coins passed down through generations. Naomi didn't have the actual family medallions, so she had 2 new ones made, and she held them in her hands on the flight home and thought about the look on Roman's face when she showed them to him. She hadn't told anyone. Not a single person. She kept the secret the way she kept most important things. Close, protected, private, until the right moment. The right moment never came. She came home 2 days early because the contract had closed faster than expected, and because she wanted to surprise him, and because she had this specific image in her head of walking into their home and finding him in his office and setting the 2 medallions down on his desk and watching everything he'd felt about the years of trying finally break open in his expression. Instead, she walked into the hallway and heard Camille laughing. Let's talk about Camille for a moment, because you need to understand who she was before you can fully understand what she did. Camille Cross was 3 years younger than Naomi and had spent her entire life in the specific kind of shadow that brilliant older siblings cast without meaning to. It wasn't that Naomi tried to make Camille feel small. She genuinely, actively worked to lift her sister up at every opportunity. When Camille needed money, Naomi provided it. When Camille needed a reference, an introduction, a safety net, Naomi was there. When their mother got sick and the medical bills started stacking up, it was Naomi who paid them, Naomi who managed the insurance, Naomi who drove 2 hours on weekends to sit in hospital rooms. Camille accepted all of it. And somewhere along the way, accepting started to curdle into something else. Naomi couldn't have told you exactly when it happened. Maybe it never had a specific moment. Maybe it was just the slow, grinding weight of always being the one who needed help, the one whose sister was more successful, more trusted, more respected in a world where Camille had worked just as hard and gotten a fraction of the recognition. That's the story Camille told herself anyway. Naomi had tried, in the years before everything fell apart, to bring Camille into her world. She'd recommended her for junior positions within the DeLuca organization's legitimate side. She'd introduced her to contacts who could have opened real doors. She'd had real conversations about Camille's future. And Camille had smiled and thanked her, and then, somewhere in private, had apparently decided that what Naomi was offering her was still just charity. Still just Naomi playing big sister. Still just a smaller version of a life that rightfully should have belonged to Camille. Naomi didn't know any of this yet when she pushed open Roman's office door. She just saw them standing close together in the way that people stand when they've just separated quickly. And she saw the documents on the desk, and her mind, because Naomi's mind was always working, even in moments that would shut most people down completely, processed what she was looking at in about 4 seconds. Camille's name on the organizational documents, a formal introduction to 3 allied families, a position that would have required Roman to vouch for her personally, repeatedly, over a period of months. This had not been happening for 5 minutes. Roman said her name. Just her name. Naomi. In that voice he used when he was trying to control the temperature of a room, keep things from escalating, redirect. She had heard that voice in 100 negotiations. She had always admired how well he used it. Right now it made her want to put her hand through a wall. She didn't, though. That was not who Naomi was. The anger was there. It was enormous, actually. A hot and terrible thing pressing against the inside of her ribs. But she had spent 7 years in rooms where showing the wrong emotion at the wrong moment was genuinely dangerous, and the discipline had become part of her. She looked at Roman. She looked at Camille. She looked at the documents. She said nothing. Then she turned and walked out of the office, and down the hallway, and out of the house. Camille called after her. Roman followed for 3 steps and then stopped, because he knew, he had always been able to read a room, that anything he said in that moment would make it worse. Naomi sat in her car for 4 minutes, not crying, not shaking, just sitting very still, the way she sat when she was working through a complicated problem. Then she picked up her phone and called her financial attorney. "I need to withdraw my personal guarantees from the Hartman Agreement and the Velez Port contract," she said, "tonight if possible." Her attorney, a man named Gerald, who had worked with Naomi for 5 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by anything she asked him to do, said he would start immediately. "Both of them?" he asked. "Both of them," Naomi said. She drove away from the house she had helped build, with 2 silver medallions in her coat pocket and a secret she would not tell Roman DeLuca for 5 years. By midnight, the Hartman agreement was in technical default. By 2 in the morning, Gerald had sent the paperwork on the Velez contract, and the withdrawal was being processed. By 6 a.m., Roman's phone was going off in ways that had nothing to do with normal business. Naomi knew exactly what would happen. She had spent years building those agreements, which meant she understood precisely how fragile they became the moment her name was removed from them. The Hartman family didn't do business with Roman DeLuca. They did business with Roman DeLuca as guaranteed by Naomi Cross, whose financial reputation and personal credibility were the actual currency those deals ran on. The Velez contract was the same. The Port Authority relationships were the same. A significant portion of what Roman believed was his power base was actually built on the foundation of Naomi's word, and Naomi had just taken her word back. She wasn't doing it out of revenge. Or, she was doing it partly out of something that felt like revenge. She was honest enough to admit that, but it was more than that. Those were her guarantees, her credibility on the line, her name attached to agreements that benefited an organization she had apparently just been quietly removed from by the people she trusted most. She had every legal and professional right to withdraw her personal guarantees, and she did it not to destroy Roman's empire, but because she was not going to stand as financial collateral for a man who had spent months introducing her sister to his allies as her replacement. She checked into a hotel under a name Roman wouldn't recognize, an old company name from a subsidiary she'd helped set up years ago and that he had mostly forgotten about. And she sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands over her stomach. "I know," she said quietly, to the 2 people who weren't born yet and couldn't hear her. "I know. I'm figuring it out." Her phone showed 17 missed calls from Roman, 6 from Camille, 2 from Gerald checking in. She answered none of them. She pulled out a legal pad and a pen, the way she always did when something needed to be thought through completely, and she started writing. Not about Roman, not about Camille, about what came next and what her children were going to need from her, and what she was going to have to do to make sure they had it. She wrote for 3 hours. When she was done, she ordered room service, ate for the first time since she'd gotten on the plane in Geneva, and then she called the one person she trusted with her physical location. A woman named Dara, who had been Naomi's closest friend since college, and who had never once, in 15 years of friendship, given her a reason to question that trust. "I need you to not tell anyone where I am," Naomi said when Dara picked up. "Not even if they tell you something happened to me. Especially if they tell you something happened to me." Dara was quiet for a moment. "Are you safe?" "Yes, for now." "Naomi." Dara's voice had gone low and careful. "How bad is it?" Naomi looked at the legal pad, at the 3 hours of notes, at the 2 phone numbers she had written at the top, her attorney and an investigator she had used twice before for financial due diligence on major contracts. "I don't actually know yet," she said. "I just found out about the part I was supposed to see. I haven't found out about the parts I wasn't." She hung up and sat very still for a long moment. Because here was the thing about Naomi Cross, the thing that Roman DeLuca had understood in the beginning and had apparently forgotten somewhere along the way. She didn't just understand the financial architecture of the DeLuca organization. She understood its vulnerabilities. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, because she had often been the one who helped decide where to bury them. And she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent 7 years watching an organization from the inside, that what she had seen in that office was not the whole story. It never was. The reason that thought didn't give her comfort, the reason it sat in her stomach like cold stone instead of like a manageable problem, was that it meant the betrayal was probably bigger than a husband choosing the wrong woman. It meant someone had been planning this. And Naomi had spent 3 months pregnant, distracted by joy she hadn't told anyone about, while the planning was happening around her. She looked at the 2 silver medallions she'd set on the nightstand. Then she picked up her phone and called the investigator. "I need you to pull everything you can find on a council advisor named Silas Mercer," she said. "Financial records, organizational movements, any changes in authority or paperwork over the last 6 to 8 months. I need it quietly, and I need it fast." "What am I looking for?" the investigator asked. Naomi pressed her hand flat against her stomach. "I'll know it when I see it," she said. "Start tonight." She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling of the hotel room for a long time. In 3 months, she was going to have 2 babies. She didn't have a safe house. She didn't have a plan, She had a legal pad, an investigator, a financial attorney, and the particular quality of intelligence that had built Roman DeLuca's legitimate empire from a collection of failing shell companies into something that actually functioned. It wasn't enough, but it was what she had. She turned off the light. Tomorrow, she would start building what she needed. The investigator's name was Theo Brandt, and he called back in 36 hours instead of the 5 days Naomi had expected. That alone told her something was wrong. Theo was a methodical man. He worked slowly and carefully the way people do when they've spent enough time in dangerous proximity to dangerous organizations that they've learned speed is how you get caught. Naomi had used him twice before, once to verify the background of a Port Authority commissioner she'd been considering for a long-term contract, and once to trace a series of shell company transfers that had started bleeding money in a direction nobody could explain. Both times he'd taken his time. Both times he'd been thorough. 36 hours meant he'd found something he didn't want to sit on. She answered on the second ring. "You need to find somewhere safer than where you are," Theo said instead of hello. "Not because anyone is coming tonight, but because what I'm looking at suggests someone has been planning for you to be exactly as isolated as you currently are." Naomi's hand tightened on the phone. She was sitting at the small desk in the hotel room, still in the clothes she'd worn the night before, with the legal pad open in front of her and 2 cold cups of coffee on the nightstand. "Tell me," she said. "Silas Mercer has been moving quietly inside the DeLuca organization for at least 8 months. Not loudly. He's not the type. But if you look at the sequence of changes, who got rotated off which councils, which financial advisors suddenly retired, which external partners started receiving their communications through Mercer's office instead of through yours, there's a pattern." "He was building a parallel structure," Naomi said. "He was building a replacement structure," Theo said. "There's a difference. A parallel structure runs alongside yours. What Mercer built runs underneath yours. So when yours gets removed, his is already in place and nobody outside the immediate circle even notices the switch." Naomi stood up and walked to the window. The city was gray and wet outside. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass and felt how cold it was. "How long has Roman known?" she asked. The pause on Theo's end lasted exactly long enough to tell her she wasn't going to like the answer. "I can't tell you what Roman knew or when he knew it," Theo said carefully. "What I can tell you is that several of the council meetings where Mercer's realignment was formalized, Roman chaired those meetings. His signature is on the authority transfers." She didn't say anything for a moment. "That doesn't mean he understood what he was signing," she said finally. Not because she believed it necessarily, because she needed to hold both possibilities open until she had more information. "No," Theo agreed. "It doesn't, but there's something else." He paused again, and this time when he spoke his voice had dropped to a register she hadn't heard from him before. "There are records, internal council records, the kind that aren't supposed to leave the room, indicating that Mercer raised the subject of succession, specifically as it related to you. Specifically as it related to the question of whether any children you might have would qualify as DeLuca heirs." The cold that moved through Naomi then had nothing to do with the window. "When?" she said. 7 months ago. 7 months ago, she hadn't known she was pregnant. 7 months ago, she and Roman had still been going to appointments, still going through the quiet grief of trying and failing. 7 months ago, Silas Mercer had already been having conversations about her children. "He knew I was pregnant before I did," she said quietly. "I don't know how that's possible," Theo said. "It's not possible," Naomi said, "which means he didn't know. He just knew that if I ever did get pregnant, those children would become a problem for whatever he was building. So he started building a case in advance." She could hear Theo breathing on the other end. Careful, measured breaths. "There's a document," he said. "I can't verify it completely yet, but I have a partial copy. It appears to be a council resolution, unsigned, which means it was prepared but not yet enacted. It outlines a legal and organizational framework for placing any children born to the DeLuca primary family line under council oversight, not just in terms of their position in the organization, in terms of their physical custody." The room went very still. Naomi stood at the window and looked at the gray city and did not move for a long time. "They were going to take my children," she said, not a question. "If the document is what it appears to be," Theo said, "then yes. The moment you gave birth, the council, meaning Mercer, since Mercer effectively runs the council now, would have had grounds to claim the children as organizational assets, DeLuca heirs, subject to council authority. She turned away from the window. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this the way you notice something surprising. She would have expected them to shake, and they weren't, and she understood after a moment that it was because the fear had moved somewhere deeper than hands. It had settled into her spine, into the base of her skull, into the particular place in the body where the most primitive instincts live. "I need the full document," she said. "Whatever version you can get. I'm working on it. And I need you to tell no one you spoke to me. Not a hint, not an implication." "Naomi," Theo said, and his voice was tired and a little rough, the voice of someone who has been awake for 36 hours doing something he knows is dangerous. "You need to understand what I'm telling you. You can't go back there. Not yet. Not until you know the full shape of this." "I know," she said. She hung up and sat back down at the desk and looked at the legal pad. Then she picked up the pen and added a new section. At the top she wrote one word, Silas. And underneath it she started writing everything Theo had told her, in clean, organized lines, the way she had always processed information that was too large and too terrible to simply hold in her head. She wrote for an hour. Then she closed the pad, put both hands flat on the desk, and said out loud to no one, "Okay, different problem." Roman DeLuca had not slept. This was not unusual for him under normal circumstances. He was a man who ran on 4 or 5 hours and had been doing so since his 20s, a habit that his doctor had told him repeatedly would eventually kill him and that Roman had largely ignored. But this was a different kind of not sleeping. This was the kind where he lay in a bed that felt wrong and stared at a ceiling that felt wrong and replayed the look on Naomi's face 1,100 times and couldn't find an angle where it looked like something he could fix. He'd been in crisis situations before, real ones, the kind that involved actual danger and actual consequences. He knew how he moved in those situations, fast, direct, decisive, controlled. He was good at it. It was one of the things he was genuinely good at, maybe one of the few things he could say that about without any ambiguity. This was different because he couldn't find the move. Every time he tried to think about calling Naomi, he hit the same wall. She hadn't said anything when she left. She hadn't screamed or cried or thrown anything. She had just looked at him with that specific quality of stillness she had when she was processing something enormous. And then she had left. And the silence she'd left behind her was louder than anything she could have said. He picked up his phone at 6 in the morning and called Gerald. Gerald didn't answer. He called 3 more times over the next 2 hours. Gerald didn't answer any of them. By 8:30, Roman's chief financial officer, a nervous man named Philip, who had worked for the DeLuca family for 12 years and who survived by staying exactly in the middle of every situation, called and asked if Roman had seen the Hartman notification. "What notification?" Roman said. The pause on Philip's end was the kind that happens when someone realizes they are delivering news they thought their boss already had. "The Hartman agreement went into technical default last night," Philip said. "The personal guarantee was withdrawn. We received formal notification at approximately 12:30 a.m. Roman sat very still. "The Velez contract as well," Philip continued, his voice going quieter with each word. "Both withdrawals processed simultaneously. Roman, both guarantees were held personally by Naomi. Her attorneys initiated the withdrawals. We have no legal recourse to—" "I know," Roman said. He hung up. He sat in his office, the same office where everything had come apart the night before, and he looked at the desk where Camille's documents had been sitting, and he understood for the first time the full dimension of what he had done. Not just personally, structurally, financially. The Hartman agreement alone represented $300 million in legitimate business activity. The Velez port contract was bigger, and those were only the 2 she'd moved on first. He called Camille. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been awake and waiting, which told him she already knew. "Where is she?" he said. "Roman, where is she, Camille?" "I don't know." And to her credit, or maybe not to her credit, Roman wasn't in a position to be thinking clearly about credit. She sounded genuinely frightened. "She didn't call me. I've tried 6 times. Her phone goes to voicemail." "How long has this been going on?" Roman said. Not how long had Camille had feelings for him. He didn't want to have that conversation. He meant how long had Camille been meeting with his organizational contacts, being introduced under Roman's authority, building a position inside a structure that Naomi had spent 7 years creating. How long had that been happening without Naomi knowing? Camille didn't answer immediately. Camille. 4 months, she said quietly. The sound Roman made then was not a word. It wasn't, Camille started. Stop, he said. Roman, Silas approached me. He came to me. He said that you and Naomi had been. I said stop. His voice had gone to a place it didn't go often. Flat, deliberate. The kind of voice that ended conversations. Get out of my house. Take whatever you came here with. Don't use any of the accounts Naomi set up for you. Don't contact any of the people she introduced you to. And don't. He stopped, breathed. Don't call her. She doesn't want to hear from you. Don't make it worse. Camille said, Roman, please. He hung up. Then he sat in his office for a very long time, not moving, and thought about Silas Mercer. Silas Mercer was 63 years old and had been a council advisor to the DeLuca family for 11 years, which meant he had been there before Naomi, had watched her arrive, had watched her build, and had spent 11 years deciding what to do about her. He was a small man physically, narrow shoulders, careful posture, the kind of person who took up exactly as much space as the situation required and never an inch more. He wore glasses he didn't need for vision, only for the impression they created. He had no family, which was unusual in this world. No wife, no children, no visible attachments. Roman had always assumed this was a choice made in the service of the organization, a kind of professional asceticism. It was more than that. Silas Mercer had built his entire life around the acquisition of organizational authority in structures where other people held the formal power. He was not interested in being the boss. He was interested in being the person who controlled what the boss could and couldn't do. It was a specific kind of ambition, patient and quiet and almost impossible to see from the outside until it was too late. He had recognized Naomi as a threat the first time he sat in a room with her. Not because she was ambitious. There were plenty of ambitious people in Roman's orbit, because she was independent. Her financial expertise was not manufactured or contingent on Roman's endorsement. She had come in with real credentials, real relationships, real knowledge. She had built things that could survive without Roman, which meant she was the one person in the DeLuca organization who was not actually dependent on the DeLuca organization. You cannot control someone who doesn't need what you have. He had spent years trying to neutralize her quietly, routing certain information away from her, building small bureaucratic friction into her access to certain council discussions, cultivating doubt about whether her loyalties were entirely to Roman or partially to her own external relationships. None of it had worked particularly well. Naomi was too good at reading rooms and too good at finding alternate paths when direct ones were blocked. And then someone on a medical staff had made a paperwork mistake. A medical file. Naomi's file. From a reproductive specialist, incorrectly routed through an administrative system that Silas had access to. He hadn't been looking for it, but when he found it, he understood exactly what it meant. She was trying to get pregnant, had been for years, was still actively undergoing treatment, which meant the possibility was real, which meant if it worked, the DeLuca organization would have legitimate heirs who were also Naomi's children. Children whose mother had independent financial resources, independent credibility, independent relationships with powerful external partners. Children who would grow up understanding their mother's world as well as their father's. Children. Silas would never be able to control. He had started planning the same week. I was in his office when Roman called. I need you here, Roman said. No greeting. Now. Silas checked his watch. 8:52 a.m. Faster than he'd expected, but not surprising. Roman was not a stupid man, even if he was an emotionally reactive one. Of course, Silas said. Give me an hour. 20 minutes, Roman said, and hung up. Silas sat back in his chair and thought carefully. He had known this conversation was coming. He had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, by identifying in advance exactly what Roman was most likely to believe, and constructing a version of events that aligned with that. Roman needed someone to blame. He needed a narrative that let him be the person who had been manipulated rather than the person who had chosen. Silas could give him that narrative. He had been giving Roman narratives for 11 years. The difference this time was Naomi. Because Naomi, unlike Roman, would not be looking for a narrative that made her feel better. She would be looking for the truth, and she had both the intelligence and the resources to find it. He needed to move faster than she could. Roman was standing when Silas arrived. That was the first signal. Roman sat in meetings. He stood when he was trying not to lose control of himself. "Close the door," Roman said. Silas closed it. "Tell me how long you've been meeting with Camille Cross." Silas let a carefully calibrated look of concern move across his face. "Roman, I've been trying to find the right moment to bring this to you. The situation with Naomi—" "Silas," Roman's voice was very quiet. "I'm going to ask you one more time before this becomes a different kind of conversation. How long?" 4 months, Silas said. He said it directly. The way you give up information you were going to give up anyway, to create the impression of honesty. But not for the reasons Camille may have told you. "Then give me yours." Silas moved to the chair across from Roman's desk and sat, crossing one leg over the other, unhurried. Calm. The performance of a man with nothing to hide. "I've had concerns about the organization's succession continuity for over a year," he said. "Roman, you don't have a designated successor. If something happened to you, and in this business, something can always happen, the organization would fracture within weeks. I was exploring options. Camille Cross has Naomi's intelligence and Naomi's instincts for the legitimate side of the business, and she came without Naomi's." He paused carefully. "Without certain complications." "Certain complications," Roman repeated. "The financial guarantees," Silas said. "The external relationships. The degree to which the organization's legitimate infrastructure had become personally contingent on one individual. That's not sustainable governance, Roman. I was trying to build a more stable structure." Roman looked at him for a long time. Silas held the look without flinching. He was very good at this. "And Naomi finding out this way," Roman said finally. "Was that planned?" "Of course not." Silas uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. "Her coming back early was not something anyone anticipated. I intended to bring all of this to you formally, with the full council, in a structured conversation. What happened was—" "She's gone," Roman said flatly. "She pulled her guarantees off 2 major contracts last night. Gerald won't return my calls, which means he's working for her, which means she's already in motion. And you're sitting here telling me about succession continuity." Something shifted in Silas's chest, not visible on his face, but there, underneath the careful construction of his expression. Naomi had moved faster than he'd calculated. "We need to find her," Silas said. "Yes," Roman said. "We do." He looked at Silas steadily. "Get out." Silas stood, smoothed his jacket, and left the office without another word. He walked down the corridor and out of the main entrance and into the gray morning, and he took out his phone and made a call. "She's already pulled from Hartman and Velez," he said, when the other end picked up. "She has Gerald. She has information. I don't know how much. We need to move the document." "Which document?" the voice on the other end said. "You know which one," Silas said. He got into his car. The document in question was a council resolution he had been careful to keep unsigned, off the formal record, and in only one physical copy. It outlined what would happen if Naomi gave birth to a DeLuca heir. It outlined the council's authority over those children. It outlined a framework for ensuring that whatever Naomi had built independently could not be weaponized by the next generation against the organization's leadership. He had been proud of it, in the quiet way he was proud of things he knew no one else would ever see. He had not factored in Theo Brandt. He did not know about Theo Brandt. That was the first real mistake Silas Mercer had made in 11 years of very careful operation, and he would not discover it for another 3 weeks, which was exactly long enough for it to become catastrophic. Naomi didn't sleep that second night either, but by the 3rd morning she had something resembling a plan. It wasn't a good plan in the sense of being safe or simple. It was a plan in the sense that it had a logical sequence, and each step led to the next, and at the end of it, she and her children would be in a better position than they currently were. That was the standard she was working to. Not ideal, not safe, just better. She called Dara. "I need a car that isn't connected to anything with my name on it," she said. "And I need you to tell Roman, if he asks you, that I called you sounding distressed and wouldn't tell you where I was." "Is that true?" Dara asked. "The second part is true," Naomi said. "I am not telling you where I am." "Naomi." Dara's voice had gone to that particular frequency she used when she was frightened but trying not to show it. "What is actually happening?" Naomi looked at her legal pad. At the section labeled Silas, at the words custody and council resolution and 8 months written in her own handwriting. "Someone has been planning to take my children before my children were even born," she said, "and my husband's signature is on the authority structures that would make it possible." Dara said nothing for a moment. "You need to get out of the city," she said finally. "I know." "How far out?" Naomi had been thinking about this, about where she could go that was far enough to be safe, close enough to still gather information, and this was the part that made every other option impossible. Not somewhere Roman's organization would think to look, which meant not anywhere connected to her own family or professional history. It meant going somewhere connected to someone else's. There was exactly one option she'd been turning over since Theo's call. Dominic Vane. She had met him exactly twice. Once at a Port Authority meeting where she had negotiated a corridor agreement that affected his shipping routes, and once at an industry dinner where they had spoken for 20 minutes about freight logistics. And she had recognized within about 4 minutes that he was significantly more intelligent than his reputation suggested. They had not been friendly. They were on opposite sides of several significant organizational boundaries. But they had been professionally respectful in a way that was not performative, and Naomi had filed him away in the category of people whose word, when given, could be trusted. She needed someone whose word she could trust. She needed someone Roman's organization wouldn't immediately reach into. She needed, most of all, someone who had absolutely no reason to hand her back. Dominic Vane and Roman DeLuca had been rivals for a decade. Walking into Dominic's territory carrying everything she knew about Roman's legitimate financial infrastructure was the most dangerous move she could make, and also, she was increasingly convinced, the only move that made any sense. She wrote his name at the bottom of the legal pad. She looked at it for a long time, then she circled it. She had spent 7 years building things inside someone else's structure. She had been brilliant and careful and loyal, and it had bought her a husband who signed council resolutions giving other men authority over her unborn children while her sister laughed in his office. She was not going to do that again. She put the legal pad in her bag, picked up the 2 silver medallions from the nightstand where they'd been sitting for 3 days, and put them in her coat pocket. Then she checked out of the hotel, walked to a parking garage 2 blocks away, and got into the car Dara had arranged for her. She had 400 miles to drive and a life to rebuild from scratch. She pointed the car north, and she drove, and she did not look back at the city in the rearview mirror because looking back was a thing she was done with. She drove through the night without stopping except once, at a gas station somewhere past the state line where she filled the tank and bought 2 bottles of water and a packet of crackers, and stood beside the car in the cold dark for exactly 90 seconds breathing air that didn't smell like the hotel room she'd been sitting in for 3 days. The attendant inside didn't look up from his phone. Nobody knew where she was. For right now, that was enough. The road north was empty at that hour, the kind of empty that feels specific to the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the world seems to have agreed to pause. Naomi drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat turned up and the radio off, because she didn't want music, and she didn't want news, and she didn't want anything moving through her head except the problem in front of her, broken into its components, examined one at a time. Component 1. She was pregnant with twins, approximately 14 weeks, and the only people who knew were herself and 2 medical professionals who were bound by confidentiality. Component 2. A man named Silas Mercer had spent at least 8 months building an organizational framework designed to give him legal and structural control over any children she produced. Component 3. Her husband's signature was on documents that made that framework possible. Component 4. She was driving toward the territory of Roman DeLuca's primary rival with no guarantee of reception, no appointment, and nothing to offer except what she knew, which was, she reminded herself, considerably more than most people walking into Dominic Vane's territory would be carrying. She ran through these 4 things in a loop for the first 2 hours of the drive. By the 3rd hour, she had stopped looping and started planning, and by the time gray light began collecting at the edges of the sky, she had something that felt less like hope and more like direction, which was what she actually needed. Hope was a feeling. Direction was a decision. She pulled off at a rest stop as the sun came up properly, got out of the car, walked twice around it to get blood moving in her legs, and then sat on the hood with her coat pulled tight and her legal pad open on her knees. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she had a 3-column list. What she knew. What she needed to find out. what she had to offer in exchange for the safety to find it out in. Then she got back in the car and drove the remaining 120 miles to the edge of Dominic Vane's territory. The first person she met was not Dominic. It was a man sitting in a dark sedan parked across from the address Theo had given her, a logistics company front on a street that looked entirely ordinary, flanked by a dry cleaner and a hardware store. The man in the sedan watched her park, watched her get out of the car, watched her walk toward the building's entrance, and then got out of the sedan and placed himself between her and the door in the quiet, efficient way of someone who has done this many times. "I need to speak with Dominic Vane," Naomi said. "Nobody here by that name," the man said. He was large, not in the exaggerated way of someone who spent hours in a gym, but in the practical way of someone built for function. He had a stillness about him that Naomi recognized. She had seen it in Roman's best people, the ones who didn't need to perform threat because the threat was simply present. "My name is Naomi Cross," she said. "I was until recently Naomi DeLuca, by marriage. I've just driven 400 miles and I haven't slept in approximately 50 hours, and I have information that directly affects this organization's shipping contracts in the Southern Corridor. I would like to deliver that information to whoever makes decisions about such things, and in exchange I would like a conversation about sanctuary." The man looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Wait here," he said, and stepped inside. She waited on the sidewalk in the cold for 11 minutes. She counted them. It was something she did when she needed to keep her mind from running ahead of itself. Count, measure, observe. The dry cleaner opened at 8. A woman in her 50s unlocked the hardware store across the street and propped the door. A pigeon landed on the edge of a dumpster nearby and regarded Naomi with the particular flat judgment of city birds. The man came back out. "Come with me," he said. She had expected to be made to wait. In her experience, powerful men always made you wait, because making someone wait was itself a statement of hierarchy, a small controlled demonstration of who held time and who didn't. Dominic Vane was sitting at a conference table with a cup of coffee and a folder of documents when she walked in, and he looked up from the documents without any pretense of having been doing something else. He was younger than she'd remembered from their 2 previous meetings, or maybe not younger, but somehow more present than she remembered, sharper in person than in a crowd. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and hands that were resting flat on the table in the way of someone who was not trying to appear calm, but actually was. He looked at her for a moment, then at the man who'd brought her in, then back at her. "You drove through the night," he said. "Yes." "Are you hurt?" She hadn't expected that to be the first question. "No." "Are you being followed?" "I don't believe so. I used a vehicle not registered to my name. I didn't contact anyone who has a connection to the DeLuca organization." Dominic nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee, drank from it, set it back down. "Sit down, Ms. Cross." She sat across from him. "You mentioned the Southern Corridor contracts," he said. "Yes, but that's not actually the first thing I want to talk about." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like an adjustment, the look of someone recalibrating an expectation. "All right," he said, "there is a man named Silas Mercer who is a council advisor in the DeLuca organization. He has spent the last 8 months restructuring that organization's internal authority with the specific intent of gaining personal control over succession. He has done this using documents signed by Roman DeLuca, most of which Roman signed without understanding their full implication." She paused. "I believe he has also been building connections to regulatory contacts in the Port Authority network that affects both the DeLuca and Vane shipping operations. If I'm right, he has been positioning himself to have leverage over both organizations simultaneously." Dominic was very still. "What kind of leverage?" he said. "The kind that comes from having dirt on both sides of a territorial line," Naomi said. "The kind that lets a man nobody pays attention to make himself untouchable by making sure neither of the men people do pay attention to can move against him without exposing themselves." A long silence. "And you know this because I spent 7 years building the legitimate financial infrastructure that Mercer has been quietly burrowing into for the last 8 months, Naomi said. "I built it. I know every load-bearing wall. I know where the vulnerabilities are because I know where I compensated for them. And I know what happens when those compensations are removed." Dominic set down his coffee. "What do you want from me?" he said. Safety, she said. Not protection in the sense of bodyguards and locked rooms. Safety in the sense of a location outside the DeLuca organization's reach, where I can complete a pregnancy and figure out what I'm going to do next. In exchange, I will give you everything I know about Mercer's activity inside the Port Authority network, which I promise is worth considerably more than the inconvenience of having me here. Dominic looked at her for a long time. The man who had brought her in was still standing near the door. Nobody spoke. "You're pregnant," Dominic said. "Yes." "How far along?" 14 weeks. Roman doesn't know. It wasn't a question. He had clearly already worked that out. She answered it anyway. "No." Dominic looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus, give us the room." Marcus, the man from the door, left without a word. When the door closed, Dominic said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm telling you because it's relevant, not because I'm trying to negotiate with it." Naomi waited. "Mercer contacted this organization 3 months ago," Dominic said, "through an intermediary. The communication was framed as an exploratory conversation about," he paused and chose the next word carefully, "about what a post-DeLuca organizational landscape might look like in this region, and what role this organization might play in it." The air in the room changed. "He approached you," Naomi said. "He approached an intermediary who has done business with us. The communication was never official. We didn't respond." "But you kept the record of it." "I keep records of everything," Dominic said. Naomi sat back in her chair. Her mind was moving fast, faster than it had in days. The particular quality of acceleration that happened when pieces of information that had been sitting separately suddenly organized themselves into a shape she could see completely. Silas wasn't just trying to neutralize her. He wasn't just trying to control succession inside the DeLuca organization. I was trying to hollow out both major organizations in this region simultaneously, playing them against each other, positioning himself as the person who could offer stability to whichever side was left standing. The man was not a council advisor. He was a predator who had spent 11 years pretending to be furniture. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "There's a secure line in the next room," Dominic said. Theo answered on the first ring. "I need you to pull Mercer's external communications for the last 6 months," she said. "Specifically anything going through intermediaries rather than directly. I think he's been playing both sides." "I already found something," Theo said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they wish they hadn't found. "Naomi, there are wire transfers. Not large ones, small, irregular amounts that would look like consulting fees if you weren't looking specifically for a pattern. They go from an LLC connected to a man named Harlan Bryce. Harlan Bryce works for Dominic Vane," Naomi said. "Yes." "And the transfers go to an account connected to Silas Mercer through 2 layers of shell company," Theo said. "Naomi, he wasn't approaching Vane's organization. He was already inside it. He's had someone inside Vane's legitimate shipping network for at least 5 months." She pressed her hand against the wall of the small room and stood very still. "Harlan Bryce," she said. "Yes." "Doing what?" "That's where it gets bad," Theo said. "The transfers correspond in timing to a series of cargo manifest discrepancies on Vane's southern freight routes. Small ones, the kind that accumulate quietly over months. I think Mercer has been running a fraud operation inside Vane's legitimate business, skimming, rerouting, the kind of thing that's almost impossible to detect from inside because the people running the internal audit are working from records that have already been adjusted." Naomi closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. "How much?" she said. "Conservative estimate based on what I can see from outside. Over 8 months? Somewhere between 4 and 6 million. Enough to bankrupt the shipping division if it's exposed wrong," she said. "Enough to bankrupt the shipping division and trigger a default on the Port Authority bond agreements that division is collateral for," Theo said, "which would pull Vane's legitimate infrastructure into a financial crisis serious enough to distract him for months, which would leave the southern corridor effectively uncontested." "And that's when Mercer moves," Naomi said quietly. "That's when Mercer moves," Theo confirmed. She hung up the call and stood in the small room for a moment with her hand still flat against the wall, feeling the solidity of it. Then she walked back into the conference room. Dominic was standing now, at the window, with his coffee gone cold on the table behind him. She told him about Harlan Bryce. She told him about the wire transfers. She told him about the cargo manifest discrepancies and the Port Authority bond agreements, and what would happen if the fraud was exposed in the wrong sequence by the wrong people. She told him all of it, clearly, concisely, the way she delivered bad news in boardrooms, without softening it, without editorializing, just the information in the order it needed to be understood. When she finished, Dominic turned from the window. His face had not changed exactly, but something behind it had. She recognized the expression. She had seen it on Roman's face in the early years, before Roman had stopped letting her see his face when it was doing real things. It was the expression of a man absorbing a blow and deciding in real time how to respond to it. Harlan Bryce has been with this organization for 9 years, he said. I know, Naomi said. That's why Mercer chose him. A long silence. You could have used this, Dominic said. You walked in here with leverage over this organization, and you handed it to me instead of holding it. I don't want leverage over your organization, Naomi said. I want to be somewhere that isn't Roman's territory while I have my children. I need the fraud stopped quietly before it destroys your shipping division, because if your shipping division collapses, Mercer wins, and if Mercer wins, I will never be safe anywhere in this region. Our interests happen to align. That's not strategy. That's just the situation. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. You can stay, he said. I'll arrange something appropriate. And Marcus will deal with Harlan Bryce. Deal with him quietly, Naomi said. If this surfaces loudly, Mercer knows someone is onto him. I need him to believe he still has time. Dominic nodded once. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like recognition. I've managed crises in complicated organizations for 7 years, Naomi said. I just wasn't always the one the crisis was pointed at. She had been in Dominic's territory for 3 weeks when everything she thought she understood broke apart. It started with a phone call from Theo at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. She remembered the time specifically because she had just come from a medical appointment, the first one since she'd left the city, and she was sitting in the car outside the clinic with both hands on the steering wheel, feeling the particular mix of relief and terror that came from hearing 2 strong heartbeats when you had spent years fearing you would never hear any. I found the rest of the document, Theo said. She had almost forgotten about the document, the partial copy he'd referenced in the first call, the unsigned council resolution. In the chaos of the last 3 weeks, the fraud investigation, the logistics of setting up a safe location, the medical appointments, it had been pushed down the priority list. Tell me, she said. The section I didn't have before, Theo said, and she could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard from him before, a kind of suppressed urgency. It's not just about custody. Naomi, the full resolution includes a provision about the mother. The air in the car went very still. What provision? She said. In the event the council exercises authority over DeLuca heirs, Theo said slowly. The resolution states that the biological mother, if she is not an organizational member in good standing, can be formally declared a destabilizing influence and subjected to... He stopped. She heard him exhale. It's legally phrased, but what it means is removal. Permanent removal from the children's lives, through whatever means the council deems necessary. She didn't speak. Naomi. I heard you, she said. They weren't just going to take your children, Theo said. They were going to make sure you couldn't come back for them. She sat in the parking lot of the medical clinic with 2 silver medallions in her coat pocket and the sound of 2 heartbeats still fresh in her memory, and she understood for the first time the complete shape of what Silas had built. He hadn't been trying to neutralize her. He had been planning to erase her. And this had been in place, on paper, with language and structure and apparent legal grounding, for months before she had ever caught Roman with Camille. Which meant the scene in the office, the documents on the desk, Camille's name on the organizational papers, all of it, was not the plan. It was the execution of a plan that had already been running for most of the year. She had walked into Roman's office and seen a betrayal and thought she understood what had happened to her. She had understood almost nothing. The real question, the one that came at her now like cold water, was how much Roman knew. Not about the detail, not about the specific provisions of a document he may never have seen in full, but about the direction, about the intent, about the fact that the woman he had married and the children she might carry were being positioned as organizational problems to be eliminated. She thought about Roman's face in the office when she'd opened the door. The separation, the shock, the particular quality of his stillness when she turned and walked out. She had read it as guilt. What if it was something else? What if Roman had been standing in his own office, not knowing how to stop something that was already in motion around him, and Naomi had walked in at the exact moment he'd been trying to figure out how? Or she was doing what she had told herself not to do. She was finding the interpretation that was least devastating and reaching for it because some part of her still wanted it to be true. She pressed both hands flat on her thighs and breathed. It did not matter right now what Roman had known or wanted. What mattered was what Silas had built, and what Silas would do when he figured out that Naomi was not isolated, and not uninformed, and not the passive displaced wife he had apparently assumed she would be. She called Theo back. "Can you verify the document is the only copy?" "No," Theo said. "I can't verify that." "Then assume there are multiple copies and assume Silas knows the partial version has been compromised," she said, "which means assume he knows someone has been looking." A pause. "If he knows someone's been looking, he knows it's me," Naomi said. "Nobody else has both the reason and the access." Another pause, longer this time. "Naomi, if he knows it's you and he knows where you went—" "He doesn't know where I went," she said. But even as she said it, she was running the calculation. The hotel she'd left, the car, the route, the intermediary used for the clinic appointment, the 3 weeks of being careful, so careful. And she was finding, in the way she always found things when she looked at them honestly, the gaps. The clinic appointment. The name on the appointment was clean, a cover name Dara had helped her establish, connected to identification documents that were legitimately issued. Nothing that should trace back to her. But the clinic itself was in a town that fell within a 30-mile radius of Dominic Vane's primary operational territory, and anyone who knew she had left Roman's territory, and who knew her reason for leaving, the pregnancy, would eventually think about medical facilities, and eventually the radius would narrow. It would take time. Silas had shown himself to be a patient man. She looked at the clinic in her rearview mirror. "I have to move the medical care," she said, "farther out, different direction. That's logistically complicated at this stage of the pregnancy." "I know." "Naomi." Theo's voice went quieter. "How much time do you have before—" "5 months," she said, roughly. "And if he finds you before—" "He won't," she said. She said it the way she'd been saying things for the last 3 weeks, with a certainty she constructed deliberately, because certainty was a choice you could make and then make true by acting from it. And the alternative was paralysis. And paralysis was not available to her. She drove back to the safe house Dominic had arranged. She told Dominic about the full document that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with the remains of a dinner neither of them had eaten much of, in the flat, honest way she had come to find was the only language he understood or respected. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "This changes things." "Yes," she said. "You're not just hiding from a bad marriage," he said. "You're hiding from an organization that has a formal document describing the legal grounds for taking your children and removing you permanently." "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. "And Roman signed documents enabling this." "Enabling the council's authority, yes. Whether he saw the full resolution or understood its scope, I don't know." "Does it matter?" Dominic asked. The question sat in the air between them. Naomi looked at the table. "It matters to me," she said. "It doesn't change what I have to do." Dominic nodded slowly. He turned his coffee cup in his hands without drinking from it. "What do you have to do?" She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. She had been thinking about it since the parking lot outside the clinic, since Theo's voice on the phone delivering the worst version of a document she'd already known was bad, since the moment she had understood that what she was dealing with was not a betrayal by one man and one sister, but a system that had been carefully constructed to consume her. You could not hide from a system. You could not outlast it. You could not negotiate with it, because it had been built specifically to ensure that the person being consumed had no standing to negotiate. There was only one thing you could do with a system designed to destroy you. You had to walk back into it, carrying everything it had done, lay it in front of everyone with standing to see it, and make sure that when the light hit it, nobody in that room could pretend they hadn't seen. "I have to go back," she said. Dominic looked at her. "You're 5 months pregnant." "I know." "With twins." "I know that too." And the man who built this system is still in place, still has access to Roman's authority structures, and doesn't know you have the document yet. Which is the only advantage I have, Naomi said, and it has an expiration date. The moment he figures out I have it, he moves to the next phase, whatever that is. Dominic set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long time. Not the way Roman had looked at her, not assessing her or measuring her against some internal rubric of use and value, but the way someone looks at a person they are taking seriously. "You're not going back yet," he said. "Not pregnant, not now." "I know," she said, "but I'm going back." Something shifted in his expression. "Then we use the time," he said. "Yes," Naomi said, "and in the meantime you let me deal with Harlan Bryce properly and stop the freight bleeding before it becomes a crisis. Because if Mercer loses his inside position in this organization, he loses half his leverage, and he gets nervous, and nervous men make mistakes." "Yes," she said. "And you tell me everything you know about the Southern Corridor contracts," he said, "because if Mercer has been working around them for 5 months, I need to understand exactly where." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He stood, picked up both coffee cups, carried them to the sink. Then he turned around and said, in a voice that was matter-of-fact and completely without sentiment, "Nobody is taking your children." It was such a simple thing to say, such an ordinary collection of words. Naomi had spent weeks telling herself the same thing, in various formulations, with varying degrees of conviction. Hearing someone else say it without drama or negotiation or any apparent expectation of gratitude did something to her she hadn't expected. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. She did not say thank you because he hadn't said it in a way that asked for thanks, and she had spent enough time around men who said things in ways that asked for something in return that she knew the difference. She picked up her legal pad. She flipped to the section on the Southern Corridor contracts, and she started talking, and Dominic pulled his chair back to the table and listened. And outside the window, the night was cold and the street was quiet, and somewhere 400 miles south of where she was sitting, Silas Mercer was making his next move without knowing that the woman he'd been building a document to erase had spent the last 3 weeks building something of her own, something he had not accounted for, something that was not a plan or a strategy but a decision. The decision that she was no longer going to survive this situation. She was going to end it. 5 months. That was what she had. 5 months between the night she sat at Dominic Vane's kitchen table and made the decision to go back, and the night she actually could. 5 months of controlled breathing and legal pad pages and medical appointments in rotating clinics across 3 different counties. 5 months of learning the shape of a man she hadn't expected to trust, and discovering that trust, when it wasn't asked for, settled differently in the body than trust that had been negotiated. She used every day of it. The work started the morning after the kitchen table conversation, when Naomi laid out everything she knew about the Southern Corridor contracts on Dominic's conference table and spent 4 hours walking his logistics director through the exact architecture of Mercer's fraud operation. Not summarizing, detailing, the specific manifest numbers, the routing adjustments, the timing of the wire transfers relative to the cargo discrepancies. The way the internal audit trail had been adjusted at the data entry level, which was the kind of thing that only made sense if you understood that the person doing the adjusting was not a sophisticated financial criminal, but a mid-level shipping coordinator who had been given very specific instructions and a very specific amount of money to follow them. Harlan Bryce was not the architect. He was the tool, which meant the architecture was somewhere else, and Naomi knew where to look for it. She spent the second week building what she privately called the map, a complete visual reconstruction on 3 large sheets of paper taped to the wall of the room Dominic had given her to work in, of every financial and organizational connection. She could trace between Silas Mercer and the structures he had built inside both the DeLuca and Vane operations. She used colored markers. She used arrows. She wrote names and dates and amounts in her precise small handwriting until the 3 sheets of paper looked like the inside of a mind that had been holding too much for too long and finally had enough space to put it all down at once. Dominic came in one evening and stood in the doorway looking at the wall for a long time without speaking. "How long did this take you?" he said. "The paper? 3 days? The actual knowledge? 7 years. He nodded slowly. He stepped closer to the wall, studying it. His eyes moved across the connections the way hers did when she was reading a balance sheet, not looking for one thing, but reading the whole shape, the pattern of it. He's been running this for longer than 8 months, Dominic said. Yes, Naomi said. 8 months is when the active execution started. The planning goes back at least 2 years, maybe further. Dominic's jaw shifted slightly. He was already doing this when Roman brought him on. That's what I think, Naomi said. I think Silas Mercer has been looking for an organization to do this too for most of his career. He found the DeLuca organization 11 years ago, and he has been slow-walking this plan ever since. Roman's organization was the host. Yours was always going to be the next phase. A silence. And the children, Dominic said. His voice had gone careful in the way it did when he was approaching something he wasn't sure how to hold. The document, that wasn't just about succession. No, Naomi said. The children were insurance. If I ever produced DeLuca heirs, those heirs, controlled by Mercer through the council, would give him permanent authority inside the DeLuca bloodline. He could never be removed. Even if Roman eventually figured out what had been done to him, even if the council turned, the heirs would be his leverage. Permanently, generationally. The words sat in the room between them. Dominic looked at the wall one more time. Then he said, He's not going to know what's coming. That's the plan, Naomi said. The twins came 6 weeks early. Not because anything was specifically wrong, the doctor told her afterward. Sometimes with multiples it simply happened, the body making a calculation of its own. Naomi was in the middle of a phone call with Theo when it started, sitting at the desk in her room with the legal pad open and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her, and she stopped mid-sentence and said, I have to go. With a steadiness in her voice that she would later not be able to account for because the steadiness was not something she chose. It was just there. She called the number Dominic had given her for medical emergencies. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and breathed the way they'd shown her and counted between breaths and waited. The hospital was 40 minutes away. It was the longest 40 minutes she could remember. Micah came first, which the nurses said was typical for the first twin. He was small, startlingly small in the way of premature babies, a shock of dark hair, a cry that sounded outraged, which made the delivery nurse laugh in the unselfconscious way of someone who has heard thousands of first cries and still finds them remarkable. Naomi heard that cry and felt something in her chest that she had no word for. Not joy exactly. Something older than joy. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. Amara came 17 minutes later. She was quieter than her brother. She looked at things. Even in those first blurred minutes, she had a quality of observation about her. Dark eyes moving with a focus that seemed impossible in something so new and so small. Naomi lay in the hospital bed at 3 in the morning with one baby in each arm and was, for a period of measure, completely unable to think about Silas Mercer or Roman DeLuca or the document or the map on the wall or any of the machinery of the last several months. There was just this. 2 small people who existed, who had not existed before and now did. She stayed in the hospital for 4 days. Dominic came on the second day, appeared in the doorway of the room with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, uncertain, which was not an expression she associated with him, and holding something wrapped in paper that turned out to be, when unwrapped, 2 small hand-knitted blankets in gray and yellow that his assistant had apparently gone out specifically to find. My assistant suggested it, he said immediately, as if she'd asked. They're perfect, Naomi said. He sat in the chair by the window, not close, keeping a respectful distance from something private, and he looked at the 2 small faces above the 2 gray and yellow blankets, and he said nothing for a while. How do you tell them apart? He finally said. Micah has his father's ears, Naomi said. She said it simply, without charge, because it was just true. And Amara has mine. Dominic nodded, then quietly, They're safe here, for as long as you need. She didn't answer. She looked at the 2 faces. She thought about the document. She thought about the word permanently and what it meant when applied to the removal of a mother from her children's lives. I need 8 weeks, she said, after I'm discharged. 8 weeks and then I go back. Dominic didn't argue. He stayed for another hour, mostly in silence, which she had come to understand was not discomfort on his part, but a particular quality of presence, being there without demanding anything from the space. It was rarer than it should have been, and she had stopped taking it for granted somewhere around the third week of working alongside him. When he left, Naomi looked at Micah and Amara for a long time. "I know you're going to have questions someday," she said quietly. "About all of this. About why things happened the way they did. I'm going to try very hard to have real answers for you instead of comfortable ones." Micah made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite nothing. Amara looked at her with those dark, considering eyes. "Okay," Naomi said. "Good talk." The 8 weeks passed. Then 5 years passed. This is the part of a story where a lesser telling would skip forward in a single sentence and arrive at the climax already assembled. But 5 years is not nothing, and what happened in those 5 years is the reason the climax meant what it did when it came. Naomi rebuilt. Not cautiously, not tentatively, not in the way of someone who has been burned and is now keeping one hand near the exit. She rebuilt the way she had always worked, completely, methodically, with total investment in every decision, accepting the risk of it because the alternative was to work at half capacity, and she had never once in her adult life been able to make herself do that. She took the legitimate side of Dominic's shipping network, which had been bleeding quietly from Mercer's fraud and had structural inefficiencies that predated Mercer by years, and she rebuilt it from the accounting foundation up. New contracts, new port relationships, new regulatory standing with 3 different authority bodies that had previously viewed Dominic's operation with the mild suspicion they directed at anything in that business. She hired people she trusted. She built oversight structures that didn't depend on any single person's honesty, including her own, because she had learned in 7 years of managing Roman's finances that the most dangerous single point of failure in any organization is the indispensable person who everyone has stopped checking. She made herself checkable. She made everything checkable. Within 2 years, the shipping network was generating more legitimate revenue than it had in the previous decade. Within 3, it had become the kind of operation that attracted the sort of institutional partnerships, real banks, real insurance companies, real logistics firms, with clean records and patient capital, that Dominic had previously not been able to access. He told her once, in the 4th year, sitting in the same kitchen where she'd made the decision to go back, that she had built something he hadn't believed was possible. "What's that?" "That," she said, "an organization in this business that doesn't entirely depend on fear to function." She thought about that. "Romans did," she said, "at first, before he stopped investing in the legitimate side." "What made him stop?" "He forgot it was real," she said. "He started thinking of the legitimate business as cover, something to park the money. He stopped understanding that it could be the actual thing." Dominic turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Do you miss it?" he said. "Building something for someone else?" "No," she said. "I miss who I thought that person was." A silence. "That's different," Dominic said. "Very," she said. The children grew. This was the other thing that happened in those 5 years, why Micah and Amara grew with the speed and intensity of children who have never been told their world is small. They were different in the ways she'd seen from the first days. Micah was loud and physical and warm, the kind of child who made friends within 4 minutes of arriving anywhere and who asked questions with the aggressive persistence of someone who genuinely cannot rest until the answer makes sense. Amara was quieter and more watchful, sharper in some ways, slower to commit but completely reliable once she did. She had a quality of attention that Naomi recognized because she had spent years cultivating it in herself as a professional skill, and here it was native in a 5-year-old. They both called Dominic by his first name, which he had told them was fine. They had done so since they were old enough to call anyone anything. Naomi had never told them he was not family. She had also never told them he was. She had let them make their own determinations, and they had, and those determinations were the ones they held. She had also never told them who their father was. Not yet. Not because she was protecting Roman or punishing him or making a decision for them, because 5 years old was not the age for that conversation, and she knew that when the age came she would have it, completely and honestly. And until then she held it. Roman's empire was collapsing. Not dramatically, not in the cinematic way of a single catastrophic event. In the grinding, structural way that organizations collapse when the person who is holding them together is no longer there and nobody on the inside has fully understood until now that holding together was a thing that needed to be done. The Heartman relationship never recovered. The Velez port contract was eventually picked up by another operator at significantly worse terms than Naomi had negotiated. 3 of the banking relationships she had built dissolved within 18 months of her leaving, because those relationships had been personal, between Naomi and the people she'd worked with, and the people she'd worked with did not transfer their trust to Roman DeLuca or to Camille Cross when Naomi was no longer present. Camille. Roman had let Camille stay, in the end, or hadn't forced her to go, which was perhaps not the same thing. She had Naomi's former role in the organizational structure, Naomi's former position in the house, Naomi's former access to the accounts and contacts and systems that Naomi had built. What she didn't have was the expertise to run any of it. This was not Camille's fault in the way that incompetence is usually a person's fault. Camille was not stupid. She was in fact quite intelligent, in the specific ways intelligence expresses itself in people who have spent their lives navigating by instinct and personality rather than technical expertise. She was good with people. She was good at reading what someone wanted and giving it to them. She was good at the performance of authority, the way you hold yourself, and the way you enter a room. But she could not read a port contract. She could not identify a problematic covenant in a banking agreement. She could not tell the difference between a partner who was drifting and a partner who was building a case for departure. One by one, the relationships Naomi had built began to register that absence. One by one, they acted on it. By the 4th year, 3 senior advisors had resigned. By the 5th, 2 major international partners had quietly terminated their agreements. The banks had not withdrawn entirely, but they had moved money into protected positions that made expansion functionally impossible. Roman watched it happen. He did not watch passively. He tried, repeatedly, and with genuine effort, to stop the bleed. He brought in financial consultants. He restructured internal systems. He had conversations with partners that went on for hours and sometimes ended well in the room and badly in practice. He worked harder in those 5 years than he had worked in the preceding 10. None of it was enough. Because what was wrong was not something you could fix by working harder. What was wrong was structural, and the structure had been built by someone who was no longer there and who had apparently not been replaced, could not be replaced, because the thing she had been built from a specific combination of intelligence and relationship and trust that did not simply transfer to whoever was standing in her office. Roman found the old financial records in the 4th year. This was perhaps the moment that undid him most completely. Not the discovery itself, but the particular quality of the discovery. He had been going through archived records from the organization's legitimate operations, trying to understand why certain revenue lines had been performing so differently before and after a specific period, and he had found Naomi's handwriting in margin notes going back years. Explanations, calculations, notes about specific partners and specific concerns. Evidence, accumulated over 7 years, of dozens of interventions she had made in the organization's financial health, quiet ones, unreported ones, done without credit or acknowledgement because she was not doing them for credit. She had been rescuing him, repeatedly, without telling him. He sat at his desk with the folders spread in front of him for a very long time. Then Philip came in. Philip, who had lasted longer than most, who was loyal in the particular way of people whose loyalty is constitutional rather than conditional. And Roman looked up and said, "Did you know?" Philip understood immediately what he was being asked. "Some of it," Philip said carefully. "Not all of it. She wasn't the type to make sure people knew." Roman looked back at the folders. "She was pregnant," he said, "when she left." It wasn't a question. Somewhere in the 5th year, working through records and timelines and the things people who had known Naomi said when they thought Roman wasn't paying close enough attention, he had assembled the pieces. Philip said nothing. "I have children," Roman said. The word sounded strange in his own mouth. "Somewhere. I have children who are 5 years old, and I've never met them." "Roman, get out," Roman said. Not angrily, just with the flatness of someone who needs to be alone with a thing too large for witnesses. Philip got out. Roman sat alone with the folders and the margin notes in Naomi's handwriting, and the knowledge that had settled into him like cold concrete. He had 2 5-year-old children, and someone else had been there for every birthday, every illness, every frightened night, every first word and first step, and every ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday morning that in aggregate made up the entire substance of what it meant to be someone's parent. He had missed all of it, not because it had been taken from him, because he had chosen Camille. He had chosen the appearance of control. He had chosen to believe that Naomi was replaceable when every single piece of evidence he was currently holding in his hands told him she had never been anything close to replaceable. He had done this to himself. The sound that came out of him then was not something he would have described as crying. It was something more primitive than that, something from further down. Silas Mercer did not know about the twins until the end of the 4th year. He found out the way careful men eventually find out things they've been circling, through a chain of small coincidences that accumulated into something undeniable. A medical record, a registration document and a name that a sufficiently determined researcher could trace back through 3 layers to a woman who no longer officially existed. A school enrollment that, when cross-referenced against dates and locations, told a story. He sat with this information for 2 weeks before acting on it. He was, after all, a patient man. What he understood was that the children being alive and 5 years old and apparently living within Dominic Vane's operational territory meant that the document, the council resolution he had been so careful to keep unofficial, needed to become official. Immediately. Before Naomi could move. Before Roman learned the full truth and did something unpredictable with the guilt of it. He also understood that Naomi had been inside Vane's operation for 5 years, and that the nature of the work she did there meant she now knew things about Dominic's organization that made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous. A woman like that, given 5 more years, would be untouchable. He convened a private council meeting. He did not invite Roman. The resolution was brought forward, amended in one critical respect. The language around permanent removal of the mother was replaced with language about organizational custody transfer, which meant the same thing but sounded less like something that would make a room full of men uncomfortable. And it was voted on by 7 council members, all of whom Silas had spent years ensuring owed him something. 6 voted in favor, and 1 abstained. The document became official on a Thursday afternoon while Naomi was sitting at a desk 400 miles away, reviewing a freight contract, and Micah and Amara were at school 10 minutes down the road. She didn't know, not yet. But the thing about Silas Mercer's plan, the thing that had always been true about it, and that he had never fully accounted for, was that it required Naomi to remain in a position of relative isolation. It required her to be someone without allies, without information, without the resources to fight a formal council resolution through legitimate channels. He had been working from a 5-year-old picture of her circumstances. He did not know what she had built. He did not know about the map on the wall or the 3 sheets of paper or the 5 years of documented evidence she had been assembling, methodically and completely, of every move he had made inside both organizations. He did not know that Theo Brandt had, over the same 5 years, cultivated 3 separate sources inside the DeLuca Council, one of whom had been in the room on Thursday afternoon. He did not know that Naomi had been ready to go back for 6 months and had been waiting, specifically and deliberately, for him to make a move that would bring the council's authority into question in a way that could be formally challenged. She had, in other words, been waiting for exactly this. She found out about the Thursday vote on Friday morning when Theo called. She listened to everything he told her without interrupting. Then she said, "How long do we have before they move on the school?" A pause. "You think they'll go directly for the children?" He needs them in physical custody before any challenge can be mounted," Naomi said. "That's the logic of the document. Organizational custody isn't theoretical. It requires possession. So yes, he'll move on the school." "How long?" "I don't know. Days, maybe less." She was already standing. "I need Dominic, now." She found him in the logistics center, standing over a shipping manifest with his operations manager. He looked up when she came through the door, and something in her face told him immediately. "Out," he said to the operations manager, who left without question. Naomi put Theo's call on the table between them and told him in 3 sentences what had happened. Dominic's face did not change. This was the thing about him she had come to count on. His face did not change in a crisis the way some men's faces changed, did not go red or tight or afraid. It went still instead, the particular stillness of someone directing everything toward decision. "Security at the school," he said. "Yes, and I need to go in person." "We go together," he said. "Dominic, together," he said. It was not negotiable. She could see that. She also knew him well enough by now to know that arguing with it would waste time she didn't have. Then move fast, she said. They were out the door in 4 minutes. The school was a low building on a quiet street, the kind of place that seemed designed to look unthreatening. Pale brick, big windows, a playground visible from the road with its primary colored equipment and its comfortable ordinariness. Naomi had chosen it carefully, which meant she had also chosen the approach routes and the exits, and had made arrangements with the administration that had been presented as routine security upgrades, but were in fact a specific set of protocols triggered by a specific set of circumstances. Those protocols had been triggered 20 minutes before Naomi arrived. The two teachers Naomi trusted most had already moved Micah and Amara out of their classroom under the pretext of a plumbing issue requiring evacuation of their wing. They were in the school's administrative office when Naomi came through the door, and Micah looked up from the crayon drawing he was working on with the uncomplicated relief of a child who has been told something odd is happening and does not fully understand it, but is glad to see his mother. "There's a pipe thing," he said. "I know," Naomi said. Amara said nothing. She looked at Naomi's face, and then at Dominic behind her, and then back at her mother, and her 5-year-old face had that specific quality of attention that Naomi had stopped being surprised by. "We're leaving now," Amara said. Also not a question. "Yes," Naomi said. "Is it bad?" "We're handling it," Naomi said. Amara picked up her backpack with the precise deliberateness of a child who has decided not to be scared yet, and reached up with her other hand. Not for Naomi's hand, for Dominic's. Naomi saw Roman's face in her memory for just a moment, the face from 7 years ago, the one she had loved, the one she had trusted. Then it was gone. She picked up Micah, and they moved. They were back in the cars and away from the school in under 6 minutes. It was 3 minutes after that when Dominic's security team monitoring the street reported 2 vehicles approaching the school from the south, with plates that did not belong to any parent or staff member they had on record. They had made it out with 3 minutes to spare. 3 minutes. Naomi sat in the back seat with Micah pressed against her side and Amara on her other side, watching the road with those dark, serious eyes, and she felt the 3 minutes like a physical thing in her chest, something with weight and temperature. 3 minutes. She pressed her lips together. "Mom," Micah said. "Yes." "Are the bad people going away?" She looked at her son, 5 years old, his father's ears and her own stubborn set of jaw. "No," she said, "not yet, but they're going to." Micah thought about this. "How?" "Because," Naomi said, "I know everything they did, all of it, and I'm going to show it to the people who need to see it." "And then?" "And then it's done," she said, "and we don't have to run anymore." Micah absorbed this the way he absorbed information, quickly and completely, and then moved on. He leaned back against her arm and looked out the window. Amara was still watching the road. Dominic's security team captured 3 of the vehicle's occupants in the blocks surrounding the school within the following hour. On their phones and in their physical documents were communication records. Encrypted, but Theo had the kind of contacts who did not find encryption particularly discouraging when properly motivated. By that evening, the first payment records had been decoded. By midnight, the chain led in a direction that was entirely expected and confirmed everything she had. Naomi sat at the table in the safe house, not the original one, a new one they'd moved to that afternoon, with the decoded records and her map and 5 years of documented evidence and Theo on speakerphone and Dominic across the table, and she said, "I need the tribunal." "The tribunal requires a formal request from a family member with standing," Dominic said. "I know, I have standing. Roman has to be there." "I know that too," she said, "and he doesn't know yet." "No," she said. She looked at the table, at the evidence, at 5 years of work spread out in organized sections that each told one part of a story that, taken together, told the full story of what Silas Mercer had done and who he had done it to and how long he had been doing it and what it had cost. She picked up her phone. She found the number she had not dialed in 5 years. She looked at it for a long moment. Dominic said nothing. Micah and Amara were in the next room, asleep, 2 hours past their bedtime after a day that even their 5-year-old resilience had eventually worn down against. She thought about Roman sitting somewhere in the mansion she had walked out of 5 years ago. She thought about whether he knew yet. She thought about what it would do to him to find out that the children she'd been carrying when she left were now 5 years old and he had missed all of it. She thought about whether she cared. The answer was not simple. It had not been simple for 5 years, and she had stopped expecting it to become simple. She was not a person who ran from complicated feelings. She sat with them. She looked at them. She decided what to do about them. She decided to call him. The phone rang 4 times. Then Roman DeLuca said her name in a voice that told her, in the 3 syllables of Naomi, that he already knew. Not about the tribunal, not about the evidence, but about the children, about the thing that had been missing from his life for 5 years, and that he had only recently understood was not an absence but a consequence. I need you to attend a tribunal, she said. In 8 days, I'm bringing evidence of what Silas Mercer has done. To you, to me, to this organization, to Dominic Vane's organization. All of it. I need you there. A silence. Naomi, Roman said, and his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Not the controlled register of the man who managed rooms. Not the authority. Something stripped of all of it. I know about the children. I know you do, she said. I should have... Roman. She kept her voice level. 8 days. I need to know if you'll be there. Another silence. I'll be there, he said. Thank you, she said, and she ended the call before he could say anything else, because she did not have room right now for what he might say, for the apology or the grief or whatever version of it he had been carrying. She would have room for it later. Maybe. In the way you eventually make room for things that are true even when they're painful. Right now she had 8 days. She put the phone down. She looked at Dominic. 8 days, she said. He nodded. It's not enough time, she said. Not complaining, just stating the parameter. We make it enough, he said. She pulled the legal pad toward her. She turned to a new page. At the top she wrote one word, tribunal. And underneath it, she began writing the sequence of everything that was going to happen in 8 days. The order of evidence, the names of the witnesses, the specific documents, the chain of custody for each piece, the order in which the information needed to land to be most completely undeniable, because she had spent 5 years building the case, and now she had 8 days to turn it into something that a room full of the most powerful families in the region would see clearly enough that not a single one of them could look away. She wrote until 3 in the morning. When she finally stopped, her hand was cramping and the legal pad had 32 pages of notes, and Dominic had fallen asleep in the chair across from her with his arms crossed and his chin down. The particular posture of someone who had intended to stay awake and hadn't managed it, which she had seen from him before, and which still had the quality of something private that she hadn't expected to be allowed to see. She capped the pen. She looked at the 32 pages. She looked at Dominic asleep in the chair. She looked at the door to the room where Micah and Amara were sleeping. She looked at all of it, this specific configuration of her life that she had built from the rubble of a betrayal that had been meant to destroy her. And she felt something move through her that was not triumph and not peace, and not any of the things she would have predicted. It was readiness. Just readiness. The complete and total absence of hesitation. She stood up, straightened the pages of the legal pad, and went to check on her children. 8 days. She was ready. The 8 days did not feel like 8 days. They felt like something compressed and airless, the way time moves when every hour inside it carries the weight of a decision. Naomi slept 4 hours a night and worked the rest. And she did not experience this as deprivation because there was no room in her for the feeling of deprivation. There was only the work and the sequence and the 32 pages of notes that became 47 and then 61 as she refined and reorganized and tested each piece of evidence against the hardest questions she could construct. Theo drove up on the 3rd day with 3 boxes of physical documents and a hard drive, and the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is relieved to set it down. He sat at the table across from her and they went through everything together, piece by piece, in the methodical way of people who understand that the difference between evidence that lands and evidence that gets dismissed is almost always sequencing, not the facts themselves, the order in which a room full of people encounters them. Mercer's going to have counsel, Theo said on the 4th day. Organizational counsel, family counsel, possibly independent counsel. He's been in this world long enough to have prepared for exactly this kind of proceeding. I know, Naomi said. The council members who voted for the resolution, Some of them will recant, say they didn't understand the full scope. I know that too. So the resolution alone isn't enough to... The resolution is the frame, Naomi said. Everything else is the picture inside it. The fraud operation inside Vane's shipping network, the wire transfers, the council authority transfers that Roman signed without full disclosure, the communication between Mercer's intermediary and Harlan Bryce, the encoded payment records from the school operation. She stopped. And the medical file. Theo was quiet. He accessed my medical records, she said. That's how he knew I was in treatment. That's how the planning started. And I can prove it. That's the most personal thing in there, Theo said. Yes, Naomi said. And it's the most important, because it establishes intent before anything else happened. Before Roman signed anything. Before Camille was approached. Before the first wire transfer. Silas Mercer accessed a private medical record and used the information in it to begin building a system designed to strip a woman of her children before those children existed. She looked at Theo steadily. I need the room to understand that first. Everything else follows from that. Theo looked at the table. Then he nodded. I'll have the documentation ready, he said. On the 6th day, Roman called. She let it ring twice before answering, not from hesitation, but from the simple need to finish the sentence she was writing. The location, he said. I need the location of the tribunal. She gave it to him. A neutral facility, not DeLuca territory, not Vane territory, a conference center used for legitimate industry meetings that had been reserved under a name connected to neither organization, and that Dominic's people had swept twice for anything unwelcome. Who else will be there? Roman said. Representatives from 7 families, 3 independent investigators, Dominic. A pause. And Silas. A silence on Roman's end. He knows it's coming, Roman said. Yes. He was formally notified 48 hours ago, as required by the tribunal protocols. He has the right to present a defense. He'll use those 48 hours. I know, Naomi said. So did I. Another silence. Naomi. His voice dropped. My children. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything. By sitting with it in advance, feeling the full weight of it, deciding how she was going to hold it. They're well, she said. They're healthy. They're 5 years old and they are... She stopped for a moment. They're remarkable people. Both of them. She heard him breathe. I want... He stopped. Started again. I don't have the right to want anything. I know that. I just... Roman, she kept her voice steady. 2 days. After the tribunal, we can talk about what comes next. Not before. Okay, he said. The word came out rough, like it had been sitting in a tight space. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, then she put it down and went back to work. The morning of the tribunal, Naomi woke at 5 without an alarm. She lay in the dark for several minutes, listening to the building around her. The particular silence of a place where other people were also awake, and also not making noise, the kind of silence that has texture. Dominic's people were already positioned. Theo was already at the venue. The boxes of evidence had been transported the night before under escort and were locked in a room she had the only key to. She got up and showered and dressed in the clothes she had chosen 4 days ago. A dark structured jacket, dark trousers, flat shoes, nothing decorative. She had spent 7 years dressing for rooms full of men who needed to be managed, and she knew exactly how clothing functioned as communication in those rooms. Today, she did not want to communicate anything except competence and permanence. The visual equivalent of, I am not going anywhere, and I have been here longer than you think. She put the 2 silver medallions in her jacket pocket. She didn't examine the decision, she just did it, the way she sometimes did things that came from a place below conscious reasoning, and trusted that the understanding of it would arrive later. She knocked on the door to Micah and Amara's room. Amara opened it immediately, which meant she had also been awake. Today's the day, Amara said. Also, not a question. Today's the day, Naomi said. Micah was sitting up in bed with his hair going in 3 directions and the slightly dazed expression of someone who has been awake for 30 seconds. Are we coming? No, Naomi said. You're staying with Elena. Elena was Dominic's assistant, who had over 5 years become the closest thing Micah and Amara had to an aunt, and who Naomi trusted with them completely. Micah accepted this. Amara looked at her mother's face for a moment with those dark, considering eyes. "You're ready," Amara said. "Yes," Naomi said. "Okay," Amara said, and went to get her shoes, because that was how Amara processed things. She assessed, determined what was true, and then moved on to the next practical matter. At 5 years old, she was already the most efficient person Naomi knew, which was either a gift or a warning or both. Naomi hugged Micah, who hugged her back with the full-body commitment of a child who has not yet learned that adults hold back in embraces. She felt his weight and his warmth and the particular smell of him. Something like grass and something like sleep and something entirely specific to him that had no name, and she held it for a moment. Then she stood up. "Be good for Elena," she said. "We're always good," Micah said, which was technically true in the sense that good and quiet were not the same thing, and he had never claimed to be quiet. She left the room. Dominic was in the hallway, already in his coat. They looked at each other for a moment. Nothing needed to be said. They had gone over everything. They had done everything that could be done. They walked out to the car together in the early morning dark. The conference center was a building Naomi had been in once before, years ago, for a Port Authority industry meeting that had had nothing to do with any of this. She remembered it as neutral and functional, the kind of place designed to host the business of industries that needed privacy without drama. Long tables, good acoustics, windows that admitted light without making anyone feel exposed. The family's representatives arrived between 8 and 9. 7 groups, each with 2 or 3 people, filing into the main room with the particular careful formality of people who understood that what happened today would affect structures they had spent years building. They were not here because they liked Naomi or trusted Dominic or had any particular investment in the outcome. They were here because they had been formally convened and because not appearing at a formal tribunal was itself a statement they couldn't afford to make. Silas arrived at 8:57. He came with 2 men Naomi didn't recognize and a lawyer she did. A man named Ferris, who had represented DeLuca organizational interests in regulatory proceedings twice during Naomi's tenure, and who was very good at the particular skill of making documented facts seem more ambiguous than they were. Silas himself looked exactly as he always looked, narrow, careful, occupying exactly the space he needed to and no more. His glasses, his precise posture, the complete absence of anything in his expression that acknowledged what this morning was. He looked at Naomi when he entered the room. She looked back at him. She had spent a long time imagining this moment, not fantasizing about it, which was different, but genuinely preparing for it the way you prepare for something you know will test you in ways you can't entirely predict. She had expected to feel something large. Anger, maybe. Or the cold version of anger that had carried her out of Roman's house 5.5 years ago. What she actually felt was focused, very, very focused. The way she felt at the beginning of a complex negotiation when she had done all the preparation she could do, and now the only thing left was to be completely present for what happened next. She nodded at him once, a neutral acknowledgement. He nodded back, also neutral, also controlled. 2 people who understood each other completely and had never once spoken honestly. Roman came in at 9 o'clock exactly, which she had expected. Whatever else Roman DeLuca was, he was not a man who arrived late to important things. He came in alone, which she had not expected. No aide, no counsel, no representative. Just himself, in a dark suit that fit the way his suits always had, with the particular quality of physical presence he had always carried that filled whatever room he entered. He looked older, not badly older, just real older, the kind that comes from years of carrying consequences rather than just making decisions. His face had lines in it she didn't remember. His eyes, when they found hers across the room, were different in a way she didn't have a precise word for. He didn't approach her. He took his seat at the far end of the table. She didn't approach him. She took her position at the front of the room. Dominic sat to her left. Theo sat behind her with the documents. The chair of the proceeding, an elder from the Hargrove family who had held that ceremonial role for 20 years, and who was trusted precisely because he was too old and too established to be pressured effectively by anyone in the room, called the session to order at 9:15. And Naomi began. She started with the medical record. She had thought carefully about whether this was the right choice, beginning with something so personal, so private, something that would reveal not just the violation, but the specific vulnerability that had been targeted. Part of her had resisted it, Part of her had said, start with the financial fraud, start with the documents Roman signed, start with the organizational architecture, build to the personal. But the sequence mattered. She had known it for 8 days and she trusted it now. She put the medical record on the table, a copy of a routing log showing that a file from a reproductive specialist's office had been incorrectly processed through an administrative system connected to DeLuca organizational accounts, and that this routing had been accessed by a user credential registered to Silas Mercer's office. This occurred, she said, 7 years and 4 months ago. At the time, I was undergoing fertility treatment. This record indicates that Silas Mercer accessed private medical information regarding my treatment through an administrative error that his office then failed to report or correct. The room was very quiet. 2 weeks after this access, she continued, the first organizational authority transfer that would later form part of the council restructuring was initiated. I am not asserting that the medical record access was the cause of what followed. I am establishing that it was the beginning. Ferris, Silas's lawyer, said, an administrative routing error is not evidence of intentional access. I'm not finished, Naomi said. Not loudly, just clearly. Ferris stopped. She moved through the evidence in the sequence she had designed. The council authority transfers, each one individually small, individually justifiable, collectively forming a pattern of control consolidation that was unambiguous when laid out in chronological order. The restructuring of advisory access. The exclusion of Naomi from specific council communications in the final 18 months before she left. Each of these presented with documentation, with dates, with the names of the people who had signed off. Roman's name appeared repeatedly. She did not editorialize about this. She simply presented the documents and moved on. Then she presented the evidence of what had happened inside Dominic's organization, the wire transfers, the cargo manifest discrepancies, the connection between Harlan Bryce and the LLC that routed to Mercer's account, the 5 months of freight fraud that had been designed to create a financial crisis that would have distracted Dominic's organization and left the southern corridor effectively uncontested. Several of the family representatives shifted in their seats. The Hargrove chair asked a question, a specific pointed question about the timeline of the wire transfers relative to the council restructuring. Naomi answered it precisely and without elaboration. Silas's lawyer made 3 more attempts to introduce ambiguity into the documentary evidence. Each time, Naomi produced a document that removed the ambiguity he had introduced. She had anticipated every line of defense. She had spent 5 years and 8 days making sure she had. Then she presented the council resolution. The full version. The section Theo had found last. The language about the mother. The language about permanent removal. Dressed in organizational terminology that everyone in the room was sophisticated enough to read correctly. She read it aloud. She read it clearly and without inflection because it didn't need inflection. The words were sufficient. When she finished reading, the room was silent in a different way than it had been silent before. Heavier. The Hargrove chair said, this document was passed by a council vote. Yes, Naomi said. 6 votes in favor, 1 abstention. Without the knowledge of the head of family, Roman DeLuca was not informed of this council session, Naomi said. Documentation of the notification records, or the absence of them, is in Section 4 of the physical evidence. She looked at Silas. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table. His expression had not changed. He was still doing the thing he was very good at, presenting the surface of a man with nothing to hide. But his hands, she noticed, were pressing slightly harder against the table than was natural. A small thing. She doubted anyone else in the room had caught it. She had been watching him for 5.5 years in her mind. She knew exactly where to look. I also have, she said, the payment records from the operation mounted against my children's school. The attempt to take physical custody of Micah and Amara DeLuca. Encrypted communications that have been decoded by forensic specialists, establishing authorization from Silas Mercer and co-authorization from... She paused. The pause was deliberate. Everything today was deliberate. From Camille Cross, she said. Camille had been sitting at the far edge of the room in the position of someone who had not been formally called, but had been permitted to attend as a family-adjacent party. She had arrived 20 minutes before the session started and had chosen a seat in the periphery that, Naomi suspected, she had selected because it allowed the maximum number of exits to be visible. Naomi had known she would come. She had not looked at her until now. Camille looked back at her across the room, and Naomi saw, in her sister's face, every stage of what was happening move through in rapid succession. The hope that maybe the authorization couldn't be proven, the recognition that Naomi would not have said it if she couldn't prove it, and then something that was not quite guilt and not quite fear, but was made of both. Naomi put the payment records on the table. Camille's digital authorization signature, a security credential connected to an account she'd been given as part of her position in the DeLuca organization, time-stamped 11 minutes before the vehicles approached the school. She signed it, someone said from the family representatives section. Not a question. Yes, Naomi said. Camille's lawyer. She had brought a lawyer, which told Naomi she had known this was coming, or had feared it, said something about context and coercion that Naomi allowed to run its course before putting the second document on the table. The second document was an email from Camille to Silas, 6 days before the school operation. 3 sentences long. In the second sentence, Camille had written, "Make sure the transfer is complete before she has time to organize. She'll move fast once she knows." She knew about Naomi. She had not been coerced. She had been informed, and she had moved first. The room absorbed this. Naomi looked at her sister. Camille looked back, and for a moment, just a moment, her face lost all of its management, and Naomi saw something raw underneath it, something that might, in different circumstances, have been grief. Naomi had thought about this moment too. She had imagined it going various ways. She had imagined feeling the old rage, the hot, terrible thing that had pressed against her ribs in Roman's hallway 5.5 years ago. She had imagined feeling nothing. What she actually felt was tired. Deeply, finally tired of a war that had started long before anyone had fired a visible shot. Tired of the specific exhaustion of loving someone who had spent years deciding that what Naomi had was more valuable than who Naomi was. She looked at her sister for 3 more seconds. Then she turned back to the room. "I have nothing further to present," she said. "The documentation is complete." Ferris spent 40 minutes presenting Silas's defense. It was a competent defense, in the way that a well-constructed argument in service of a false position is competent, organized, technically precise, focused on the gaps and ambiguities that existed in every complex evidentiary record. He challenged the chain of custody on 2 documents. He argued that the council resolution, while imperfectly constructed, was within the legitimate scope of council authority. He framed the freight fraud as the unauthorized action of a single employee, Harlan Bryce, without documented direction from his client. Naomi let him finish. Then the Hargrove chair asked Silas directly, "Were you aware of the council resolution's provisions regarding the removal of the mother?" A silence. "The language was drafted by organizational council," Silas said. "I reviewed the resolution in terms of its succession provisions. The specific language regarding the mothers. Yes or no?" the Hargrove chair said. Another silence. "Yes," Silas said. The room shifted. It was a small thing, physically. A few people moving, a breath or two. But Naomi felt it the way you feel a structural change in a room. Not in any one person's movement, but in the collective quality of the air. He had been prepared for many things. He had not been prepared for a direct question with no ambiguous exit. The Hargrove chair made a note. Then their chair turned to Roman. "Roman DeLuca," he said, "you are asked to speak to the council authority transfers bearing your signature." Roman stood. He was quiet for a moment, and Naomi watched his face. She watched it carefully, the way she had watched his face in 100 meetings over 7 years, reading the real thing underneath the managed surface. What she saw was not what she had expected. She had expected defense. She had expected the controlled pivot, the reframing, the version of events that positioned him as the one who had been manipulated. Instead, Roman said, "I signed documents I did not read carefully enough. Some of them I was told were routine administrative updates. Some of them I understood to be authority transfers, but not the scope of those transfers. In at least 2 cases, Silas presented them to me alongside other materials in a way that..." He stopped. "That's not an excuse, it's an explanation. The difference matters to me even if it doesn't change the result." He looked at the table. "Silas manipulated my fear," he said. "My fear of losing control. My fear of what would happen to the organization if I appeared weak. He had spent 11 years learning exactly how to use that fear, and he used it. That's true. He paused. But nobody made me betray Naomi. Nobody engineered that. I chose Camille. I chose to believe that my organization would be stronger with someone more controllable beside me, instead of someone who challenged me. I chose to believe Naomi was replaceable. He looked up, and his eyes moved to her. Those were my choices, not Silas's. The room was very quiet. Naomi looked at Roman DeLuca, the man she had loved, the man who had made her a promise on a night 14 years ago that he had eventually, thoroughly, broken. And she saw that the grief he was carrying was real. It was not performed. It was not a tactic. It also did not change anything. She looked away. The deliberation took 3 hours. Naomi sat in a room down the corridor with Dominic and Theo and 2 cups of coffee that went cold. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. Either the evidence had been sufficient or it hadn't. Either the room had seen it clearly enough or it hadn't. She had done everything she could do. She was, for the first time in a very long time, in a position of genuine waiting, not managing, not anticipating, not building contingencies, just waiting for other people to make a decision. She didn't like it, but she sat with it. Dominic, at some point during the second hour, said, "Whatever they decide in there, about the organization, about Mercer, about all of it, the children are safe. Whatever ruling comes out of that room doesn't change what I told you the night you drove here." Naomi looked at him. "Nobody is taking your children," he said. The same words as 5 years ago, same voice, same complete absence of performance. "I know," she said. And she did know. She had known it for 5 years, not because she'd been reassured, but because she had made it true through everything she had done. The children were safe because she had built the circumstances of their safety, piece by piece, and she had built them strong enough that a council resolution and an authorization signature could not reach through them. But hearing him say it still did something. She pressed her lips together and looked at the cold coffee. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Dominic turned his own cup in his hands. "You saved this organization $6 million and a financial crisis in the first 3 weeks you were here," he said. "Call it even." "I'm not sure that's the same category of thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A silence. "What do you want?" he said. "After this, whatever happens in there, what do you actually want?" It was such a direct question that it took her a moment to process it as sincere. She had spent so many years in rooms where that question was always rhetorical, always a preamble to someone telling her what she was going to get regardless, that her first instinct was to deflect it. She didn't deflect. "I want to raise my children in a place where they're not organizational assets," she said. "I want to work on something that's actually mine. Not Roman's cover operation and not—" She stopped. "Not even yours, if I'm being honest. Something mine." Dominic nodded slowly. "That's not incompatible with our current arrangement." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was not assessment, but simply presence. Genuine presence, without agenda. "Then that's what happens next," he said. She nodded. The door at the end of the corridor opened and the Hargrove chair's assistant appeared and said they were ready. Silas Mercer was stripped of all council authority, effective immediately. The Hargrove chair read the ruling in the flat procedural language of formal organizational decisions, which drained all drama from it and made it feel, paradoxically, more final than any more theatrical delivery would have. The fraud operation within Vane's shipping network was confirmed as directed by Mercer and would be referred to appropriate investigators. The council resolution regarding DeLuca heirs was declared invalid on the grounds of procedural misconduct, specifically the exclusion of the head of family from the session that passed it. All authority transfers bearing Roman DeLuca's signature that were found to have been presented without full disclosure were voided. Silas sat through the reading without visible reaction. When it was finished, he said, to the room generally, "I did what was necessary to protect this organization's continuity." He said it quietly and without apparent anger, as if he genuinely believed it. Maybe he did. Naomi looked at him and thought maybe he always had. Maybe the most terrifying thing about him was not that he was malicious, but that he had convinced himself the malice was something else. She had no sympathy for him, but she understood him, and understanding was not the same thing. He was removed from the room. Camille was next. The ruling on Camille was more specific and in some ways more complete. Stripped of the organizational position she'd been given through Roman's endorsement, removed from all accounts and structures connected to the DeLuca family's operations, and permanently barred from any advisory or representative role within the affiliated families. Camille stood when her name was read. She stood straight, which Naomi had not expected. She had expected collapse, or anger, or the performance of wronged innocence. What she got instead was Camille standing straight and looking at the Hargrove chair with the expression of someone who has decided to carry the weight of something without letting it take her legs. For just a moment, Naomi saw the version of her sister she had always believed was in there somewhere. The version who was not defined by what she'd done to get what she wanted, but by what she was capable of when she decided to stop running. It didn't undo what had happened, but it was something. After the rulings were read, after the room began the careful choreography of a formal proceeding drawing to a close, Camille walked toward Naomi. Naomi watched her come. Camille stopped a few feet away. She looked at her sister and her eyes were very clear in the way eyes sometimes are when someone has stopped pretending. "I know there's nothing I can say," she said. "No," Naomi said. "There isn't. I'm saying it anyway." Camille's voice was steady in a way it hadn't been in a long time. "I spent so many years wanting your life that I forgot you were the reason your life was what it was. I took everything you had, and it was still empty. Because I thought the things were the point." She stopped. "You were the point. You always were." Naomi looked at her sister. This was the moment she had imagined in various versions across 5 years. She had imagined anger. She had imagined saying the things she'd never said. She had imagined a kind of devastating eloquence that would make Camille understand every specific dimension of what she'd done. Instead, she said very quietly, "I know." Not, "I forgive you." She wasn't there. She didn't know if she would ever be there. That was a true thing, and pretending otherwise would not serve either of them. But, "I know. I see you. I see that you see it now. I am not going to pretend you don't." Camille nodded. She pressed her lips together. Then she turned and walked away, and Naomi watched her go and felt the particular weight of something that had been part of her life for as long as she could remember finally beginning to settle. Roman was last. He found her in the corridor after the room had mostly emptied, when the afternoon light was coming through the end window in the long horizontal lines of late day. She heard him before she saw him, the specific quality of his footsteps, which she would have recognized anywhere, which was its own particular betrayal of how well she still knew him even now. He stopped a few feet away. He didn't try to close the distance. "I lost the organization," he said. "Yes," she said. The ruling on Roman had been specific: loss of leadership authority, transferred to a council under independent oversight pending a full review of governance. Not prison, not the more extreme consequences that some of the evidence might have supported, because the ruling had accepted his account of what he'd known and hadn't known, and because the families had calculated that visible organizational collapse served nobody, but effective loss of everything he had built, everything he thought he was. "I lost 7 years," he said. "You lost more than that," Naomi said. "You lost what those 7 years could have been." He absorbed this. "I have 2 children I've never met," he said. "Yes. And I'm not asking for anything. I need you to know that. I'm not asking you to let me in or forgive me I'm not asking for any of that. I just need to know if there's—" He stopped, started again. "Is there any path?" "Not to you." "I know there's no path to you, but to them?" Naomi looked at Roman DeLuca. She looked at him the way she had looked at the evidence on the table this morning, clearly, without filtering for what she wanted to see, trying to see only what was actually there. What was actually, there was a man who had made catastrophic choices and was not trying to talk his way out of them. A man who was not asking to be saved from his consequences, but was asking, very quietly, for the smallest possible opening that was not nothing. "Write to them," she said finally. "Not email. Letters. Real ones. Don't ask them to call you Dad. Don't ask them to forgive you. Don't ask them for anything. Just tell them who you are. Tell them the truth about what happened, in the version that's appropriate for their age at the time. Let them decide what they want to do with that." Roman was very still. "They may not want anything," Naomi said. "That's their right." "I know," he said. And if they decide someday that they want to know you, she continued, that's their decision too, not mine, not yours. He nodded, slowly. Okay, he said. His voice was rough. She looked at him for one more moment. The man she had loved. The man who had broken her. The man who had not been able to tell the difference between what he had and what it was worth until it was gone. She didn't hate him. She also didn't have room for him anymore. Not in the way he had once occupied room in her life, that specific architecture of centrality, of someone around whom the rest of your world organized itself. That room was gone. She had built other rooms in the years since, and they were fully inhabited. Take care of yourself, Roman, she said. She walked away from him down the corridor, and she did not look back, and the sound of his footsteps behind her did not come, which meant he stayed where he was, which was what she had needed him to do. Micah asked that night while she was putting him to bed, if the bad people were gone now. She sat on the edge of his bed and thought about this seriously, the way she always thought about his questions, not looking for the answer that would make him most comfortable, but for the answer that was most true in a form he could actually use. The specific people who were causing the problem, she said, yes, they're not going to bother us anymore. And the other bad people, Micah said, the ones who aren't those. She looked at her son, 5 years old, already understanding something about the world that many adults spent decades avoiding. There will always be other people who cause problems, she said. That's true, but we know how to handle them now. We've gotten pretty good at it. Micah thought about this. Because you're smart, he said. Because we're careful, she said. And because we have people we can trust. That's more important than being smart. Dominic's one of them, Micah said. Yes, she said. And Theo. Yes. And Elena and Dara, and he was listing the way he listed things, going through the inventory with the satisfaction of a child who finds comfort in completeness. Yes, she said. All of them. He settled back against his pillow. His eyes were getting heavy. What about the man? He said. The one who's my dad. She was very still for a moment. You know about him? She said. Amara figured it out, Micah said. She said the man at the thing today had my ears. Naomi sat with this for a moment. Of course Amara had figured it out, of course. His name is Roman, she said. And yes, he's your biological father. Is he nice? She thought about the corridor, the afternoon light, the man who had not followed her when she walked away. He's someone who made some very bad choices, she said carefully, and who is trying to figure out how to live with them. Whether you ever want to know him is completely up to you and Amara, both of you, together. Micah processed this. Can we decide later? Yes, she said. Absolutely. Okay, he said, and closed his eyes with the tremendous efficiency of a child who has resolved a thing and is ready to sleep. She sat on the edge of his bed for a while after his breathing evened out. Then she went to Amara's room. Amara was already asleep, or seemed to be, her dark eyes closed, one hand curled under her cheek. Naomi stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter in the low light and felt something so large and so quiet that it had no language, only the physical sensation of it, somewhere below the sternum. She had done this. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not without the years of running and the nights of fear and the days of work so concentrated it had sometimes felt like drowning. Not without Dominic's steadiness and Theo's information and Dara's loyalty and all the other forms of help she'd had the judgment to accept and the luck to be offered. But she had done it. She pulled Amara's door mostly closed. She went outside. The night was cool and clear. The garden behind the house she had helped make into something resembling a home over 5 years, was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a day that has finally stopped demanding things from you. She sat on the stone step outside the back door and put her hands in her pockets. Her fingers found the 2 silver medallions. She took them out and held them in her palm, one in each hand, and looked at them in the dark. The jeweler in Geneva had done good work. They had survived 5 years of being carried from place to place, in coat pockets and desk drawers and the bottom of a bag, and they still looked like themselves, solid, simple, the kind of thing made to last. She had carried them all this way. She had carried them into Roman's territory and back out, into the tribunal and back out, into every difficult room of the last 5 years. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about the moment she had bought them, standing in the Geneva jewelry shop, pregnant and alone, and full of the particular happiness of a secret kept for the right reason, imagining Roman's face when he saw them. She thought about what she had understood that day, what she had believed about her life and her marriage and the future she was building. She thought about what that woman had not known yet. She didn't want to go back. That was the simple truth of it. She would not have wished the last 5 years away, even if she could have, because the last 5 years had produced Micah and Amara, and the work she'd built, and the person she'd become, and the understanding, hard-won and permanent, of exactly what she was capable of. But she thought about that woman anyway, with the tenderness you feel for someone you can no longer be. She closed her fingers around the medallions. Behind her, the back door opened, and Dominic came out with 2 cups of tea and sat down on the step beside her without asking if she wanted company. He handed her one of the cups. She took it. They sat in the quiet garden in the cool night, and neither of them said anything for a while. Eventually, Dominic said, "Micah's light is still on." "I know," Naomi said. "He'll fall asleep with it. He always does." A comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Dominic said. She thought about the question. What happens now? The question she had been asking herself for 5.5 years, in every form it could take. What happens now that I'm gone? What happens now that I know? What happens now that they're born? What happens now that it's over? What happens now that it's actually over? "I stopped running," she said. "That's the main thing." "And the rest?" "Work," she said. "The real kind. On something that actually belongs to me. Watching my children figure out who they are. Finding out what that looks like when I'm not also managing a crisis." "It looks like this," Dominic said. "More or less." She looked at the garden, the night, the light still on in Micah's window. "More or less," she agreed. She opened her hand and looked at the 2 silver medallions again. Then, with a decision that came from the same unhurried place as the decision to carry them in the first place, she put them in her jacket pocket, not throwing them away, not enshrining them, just putting them away. They were part of the story. They could stay part of the story. She didn't need to perform either grief or triumph with them, didn't need to make them into a symbol of what she'd lost or what she'd survived. They were 2 small objects made by a jeweler in Geneva that a woman had bought for her children before she understood what her children were actually going to need. What they had needed was not an inheritance. What they had needed was her. She drank the tea. The light in Micah's window eventually went off. The garden stayed quiet. And Naomi Cross sat in the cool night air of a life that was finally, entirely, completely her own. Not built for someone else, not running from something, not managing the consequences of other people's choices, and felt for the first time in longer than she could name the simple and enormous experience of having nothing left to fight tonight. Just this. Just here. Just enough.